Well, good morning, Cornerstone. We are deeply honored that you are partnering with Mennonite Central Committee for your Advent project this year, in this season that looks towards the child who is to be named Wonderful Counselor, Everlasting Father, the Mighty God, the Prince of Peace. Cornerstone, you've been deeply involved with MCC in many ways and for many years, with regular volunteers at our center, making those comforters, those beautiful blankets, helping around the office facilities, and also with your generous financial gifts for many years. So we thank you for that. I did a little bit of digging and I found that the earliest record I could find was a gift from the Cornerstone Girls Club in 1992. And I'm quite certain that that would not have been the first. But for some of you I know, MCC is a new or an unknown organization. And so I'd like to share with you a little bit briefly, the story of MCC, what we do and why, some of the needs that we are currently addressing, and how your gifts will help in this work. So MCC began as a miracle, a gospel miracle, I would say. This is how it happened. It was during and after the First World War. There was the European War, there was the Russian Revolution, and yes, there was that global flu pandemic as well, and famine that was devastating southern Russia, present-day Ukraine. And this included dozens of communities of German-speaking Mennonites, up to 100,000 people that were there. And many of them had friends or relatives that had come to North America 50 years previous. So a cry went out from those Mennonite communities to Mennonites in North America. And in July of 1920, in response to that desperate cry, delegates from a number of distinct and very different Mennonite groups, from Virginia to Kansas to Ontario, gathered together in Indiana to respond to this cry for help. They met in Indiana, they set up shop in Pennsylvania, and they formed a central committee to respond to this need. These were people from different backgrounds, different ethnicities, different histories. Some of them didn't know each other. Many of them didn't know each other at all, but they came together to serve. By October, Mennonites in Western Canada also were responding to this, and Saskatchewan became a hub for this work. They met in Regina in mid-October of 1920, to begin to collect money for the same cause. An auction was held down in Herbert, which became the very first MCC relief sale on record, and they raised $1,100 at the time. Clothing was collected. 160 tons of Manitoba and Saskatchewan flour was sent over. It took a year and a half of preparations, travel, and very complex negotiations with the Soviet government. But by May of 1922, MCC was on the ground in southern Russia, setting up 140 kitchens to feed the hungry, feeding about 25,000 people a day. In a miraculous way, God multiplied the efforts of many, many groups across North America to save lives and restore hope to thousands of people, Mennonites, Russians, Ukrainians, native Bashkirs, and more. So alongside that urgent need of immediate supplies of food and clothing, they needed to look to the future. Those farms were devastated. Their draft animals were dead or dying. So MCC arranged for 2 shipments of Ford tractors to come across so that the fields could be worked, and another year of famine prevented. By the grace of God, the harvest of 1923 was relatively good, and MCC's immediate goals of feeding the hungry were met. So this was the genesis of MCC's work of relief and development. By the mid-1920s, the crisis was over, but those seeds of practical service, of interchurch cooperation, and local partnership had sprouted and could not be easily uprooted. The work bore fruit in unexpected and remarkable ways over the decades. There was refugee resettlement as several thousand went from southern Russia to Paraguay in the 1920s. In the 1940s and 50s, another 8,000 refugees during and after the Second World War were resettled in Canada. Also during the Second World War, MCC helped to create opportunities for alternative service for peace-minded Christians who were ready to serve their country but not through the military. serving as teachers in remote schools, and many of these were Indian residential schools. Also working in mental hospitals, providing war relief overseas in England or in Jordan in the Middle East. And this continued after the war, this sense of volunteering and giving back as providing social services in Newfoundland and Labrador as that very impoverished colony joined Confederation in 1949. And so MCC sent nurses and teachers and social workers. In those first decades, MCC found its stride in providing relief, development, and peace in the name of Christ. MCC has continued to grow as a creative pioneer, finding new ways to serve the least of these. Let me outline just a number of these amazing things that have developed out of the greenhouse of MCC's work. There's a mobile meat cannery, a state-of-the-art facility built into a semi-trailer that travels throughout the eastern US and Ontario every year. This last year, 850,000 pounds of meat were canned so that they could feed the hungry in other parts of the world. Half of this went to Ethiopia. Other people who benefited from this work are in the Ukraine, in Haiti, and orphanages and hospitals in North Korea. The fair trade movement, working with local producers and craftspeople around the world. The restorative justice movement, an alternative that focuses on restoring the harm that's done to victims and offenders. The Canadian Food Grains Bank as a more effective way of feeding the hungry around the world. Thrift stores, a magical way to turn old clothes and other donated items into money, again, that can generate benefits around the world. And MCC was a Canadian pioneer of the thrift store movement. And finally, private refugee sponsorship groups. Canada is the envy of the world in the way that it has developed the ability for local groups, churches and other community groups, and you know what this is like, to sponsor refugee families. And MCC was at the heart of developing that in the late 1970s. As we now were approaching 2020, MCC had all kinds of plans and hopes for a centennial year of celebration of all these different kinds of good works and recommitment, reinvigorating the work for the next century. And then, COVID. So that has hit us hard, as it has hit everyone hard. In Saskatchewan, one of the ways that we have felt that in terms of the financial resources that we have, the 8 thrift stores that are here in Saskatchewan generally produce about $1 million in revenue for the work for this international service. The closure of these stores in spring, alongside the loss of our June relief sale, caused major challenges. So before all this hit, MCC Saskatchewan had committed to a special Centennial Campaign of $500,000. Now with COVID, this has been revised downward, and our provincial target is now $400,000, aiming at maintaining core services for vulnerable and displaced people around the world. Now the good news is, with the generosity of churches and donors throughout the province, we have reached almost $360,000 in gifts and pledges. And that is another miracle. Your gifts this season will help us to achieve that goal. So MCC is an active, thriving 100-year-old, currently involved in 50 countries or so around the world with 1,100 workers alongside local partners, that's churches and community organizations around the world. We are active in relief, in food and water, in health and education, resettling refugees, peace building, and restorative justice work. Right now, many of these programs are adapting towards COVID-related needs as we strengthen our WASH programs, that is water and sanitation and health. And I'll just outline a number of these, the kinds of things that we're doing and that your gifts will be going towards. A health clinic serving displaced peoples in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. 18,000 hygiene kits are on their way to internally displaced Syrians. Health workers for mothers and children in Somalia. Supporting churches in Colombia who are working with Venezuelan refugees. And sending comforters, those beautiful blankets that are made right here in Saskatoon, made by volunteers here and across Canada, sending them to vulnerable families in the Ukraine. Your gifts will make an impact. I'm delighted to tell you that just a week ago, MCC received a remarkable public distinction by making a top 10 list of Canadian charities with international impact out of a pool of 800 plus organizations for the second year in a row. One of MCC's distinguishing marks that were noted is its very low overhead costs. For every dollar that you give towards the work, 94 cents of that makes its way to the end project. It's one more way that MCC embodies a gospel commitment to share God's love and compassion for all. So Cornerstone, we are grateful for your gifts, and I invite you to give generously. Together, we will continue to respond to basic human needs and work for peace in the name of Christ, the Prince of Peace, into our next century. Thank you.